All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And I'm happy to welcome back to the show Jonathan Rauch. He's a senior fellow at Brookings. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of a great book. The newest one's called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan Rauch, welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be with you, Matt.
It is a pleasure. Now, one of the things I've been grappling with is what in the hell happened to America? So in 2012, the Republican Party had Mitt Romney as the nominee. And 4 short years later, we end up with Donald Trump. That seems like a pretty big jump in 4 short years. And I'm like, so what has happened? Well, one obvious thing is like everyone got an iPhone. Everyone got on social media around 2012. That's one thing. Cannabis became not just legalized, but we started it around 2012 to have it for recreational use. So maybe that's got something to do with it. You had the Obergefell gay marriage decision that was handed down at around that time, or I think 2015, something like that. There's a backlash to Barack Obama, who got reelected in 2012. That maybe that radicalized people, but there could be another reason, and that could be the decline of religion really seemed to reach a peak during this era. So you tell me, Jonathan Rauch, is it a combination, or is religion maybe the big one that gets forgotten?
Well, is that a trick question? I'm the author of a book called subtitle Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. So, but yeah, you nailed it, Matt. Where I came in is so I'm an odd person, to say the least, to be writing this particular book, because I am a lifelong atheist and a lifelong Jew and a lifelong homosexual. I've known all those things about myself since I was young, and grew up experiencing Christianity as something that was bigoted and cruel and hypocritical and hostile to people like me. And here I am saying that it turns out that Christianity is a load-bearing wall in our country, in our democracy. The book is addressed to, it's not religion generally, it's Christianity specifically. It's about the tenets of Christianity. It's about the abandonment of those tenets by Christians, and that the detrimental, I think I could even say catastrophic effects that's have both on the church and on the country. So I'm going to go with, in answer to the question that Matt Lewis posed, I'm going to go with yes. Christianity has something to do with it. I came into all this, I'm at Brookings in governance studies. We spend all day trying to think about, why is America becoming ungovernable? The change in religious observance, and that's really Christian observance in this country, in this century, just the past 15 to 20 years, is unprecedented. It's a collapse. And we can talk about what that means and what's happened and why.
Mm-hmm.
But that experiment is just not going well.
You talk about in the book that there are certain questions that religion can't answer on its own, but there are certain questions that politics and secular intellectualism can't answer. And so you need faith, religion, Christianity to, otherwise, without it, people lose a sense of purpose, of meaning. They lose some maybe moral values, but talk about those questions that the secular world just can't answer for folks.
Well, secular liberalism, footnote, by liberalism, what I mean the traditional liberalism of the founding fathers, all men are created equal, Constitution and liberal processes. I don't mean the post-war sense in America of left-wingers or progressives or any of that. So secular liberalism is great at a lot of things. It is great at creating systems that help us live together and reach consensus on hard issues, and its science is really great at explaining the material world. But there are two big questions that secular liberalism just can't really get its hands around. I say that as a secular liberal. The first is, why are we here? Is there a higher purpose in our life than just being a glob of protoplasm that accumulated and flashed in and out of existence inconsequentially? that's just not an account that most humans are naturally satisfied with. And I can't really give an account of that as a secular atheist. And people look to religion to do that, and they do all over the world. This is a constant in the human culture. They look to spirituality and religion for place in the world, a sense of position in the great chain of being, purpose, something transcendent, all of those things. And then the second thing that we can get part of the way to explaining why right is right and wrong is wrong and good is good and evil is evil. But at the end of the day, we can't give a transcendent account of good and evil that is anchored in something absolute and something independent of what humans believe. We can get part of the way there. I give my liberal friends, Adam Smith and David Hume and Immanuel Kant and the great thinkers did a lot of work on this, and it's a lot of good work. But at the end of the day, if you want to think that there is a fundamental absolute good and a fundamental absolute evil, you're going to turn to religion for that. And so for those reasons, I think that modern secular liberalism and faith, but especially the great faith traditions that have spent 2,000 to 3,000 years working on these questions, we need them and they need us. We need each other. There are different kinds of questions that both of these traditions can answer, and they're always in tension, and sometimes they're in conflict, but they only really both work when you have them both, when you have liberalism to order and moderate the impulses, the zealotry, the absolutism of religion, and when you have religion to channel and harness and give direction to people's sense of meaning in life.
Now, I think Christians would say that, yes, there's a reason why human beings have this sense that we are a stranger in a strange land and that there's more out there. And that's because there's more out there that God has given us. We have a hole in our hearts that only God could fill. And so it's only natural that we would find this earth to be unsatisfying and things like death, which we were not created for until the fall of man. I don't want to get too theological here, but there's a Christian argument that this longing makes perfect sense. But you're an atheist. How do you, is this an evolution thing? Are we evolutionarily wired in some way to have this, angst, or where does that come from?
Well, of course, people are very different and nothing is true of all of us. And I think I'm a pretty happy and fairly moral person while being an atheist. But I also recognize this is a change for me, Matt, over the last 20 years or so. But I also recognize that, I'm not one of these people who says, smart people like me don't need to be religious, but I'm glad all those dumb people out there are. Because for a bunch of reasons. One is the one I just said. I think they're important questions that only faith can really address and answer. But another is that I recognize that I'm kind of missing out on something. That there are people out there, a lot of people out there, who are in touch with what is to them a deep and important spiritual side of life, a religious side of life, which orders their life and gives a transcendent meaning to their life without interfering in their ability to function as good citizens and make good decisions, or even be, if you're Francis Collins, one of the great scientists of our time. And those people have a capacity that I lack. I think that I'm a little bit colorblind and that I don't receive those spiritual wavelengths. And so that's one answer to the question. Yeah, I think a lot of people are in touch with spiritual things in a way that I'm not. And I think that's very common. Ross Douthat of the Times just wrote a book about that, how common spiritual experiences actually are. They're much more defining than, Vulcans like me who walk around in a completely material, unenchanted world. And yeah, so there's also a lot of anthropological evidence that and sociological evidence that religion is just about the most common thing that humans do that's cultural. It's present all over the world. It's virtually a defining trait of our species. And what seems to have happened in the US is that as the formal religion declined, the great faith traditions, well, really let's name it. Okay, we're talking about Christianity and we're talking about white Protestantism, the predominant and founding faith of our country. That's what's collapsed over the past 50 years, and especially the last 20. So that's left a hole, which is being filled by secular, quote unquote, religions that don't bring those great 2,000 and 3,000 year moral and ethical traditions, but do bring a sense of zealotry and apocalyptic fear to politics, which can't bear that burden. And so turns out that faith, religion, Christianity is a load-bearing wall. And when it fails, a lot of other structures around it start to weaken.
Yeah, you mentioned Douthit. He had a tweet years ago where he said, if you don't like the Christian right, wait till you get a load of the post-Christian right. And we have seen what happens
We are
after.
getting a horse doctor's dose of that right now.
And as you know, and I think this is in the book, I believe, John Adams said, and there's a lot of quotes that are apocryphal about religion, but in this case, John Adams actually wrote or said that, you have, I'm paraphrasing here, but that the American democracy is only going to work if you have a faith that it's wholly unsuited for an electorate or a public that doesn't have these moral values. Butchered the paraphrase, I'm sure, but a long way of saying, like, I believe that when we look at the rise of Donald Trump and where we're at today, I mean, if you think of the trends, I mentioned social media. What about the rise of the anti-hero, right? Tony Soprano, Walter White, the rise of reality TV. I mean, I do believe that culture is downstream. I'm sorry, that politics is downstream from culture. And it's like probably no surprise that when you look at what's happened in our entertainment world, when you look at the loss of faith, Christian faith and religion, that we would end up with a reality show casino magnate, thrice married casino magnate, as the leader of, Ronald Reagan's Republican Party.
Well, in a sense, it's even worse than that. But just to circle back and underscore what you said a minute ago about the founders, it's not just Adams. Washington in his farewell address and Madison and Franklin, they all tell us in as many words, this is not a Christian nation we're giving you. They deliberately chose not to include references to Christ or Jesus in the founding documents, which was highly controversial at the time. That's not the point, that you have to be Christian to be American or that it's a Christian country. But what they were saying is that our constitutional system is not self-sufficient, that it won't last if it doesn't rest on a substrate of what they called Republican virtues, truthfulness, lawfulness, civility, getting educated about the key issues. And they said, we can't give you that. That's not our job. That's the job of civil society. And that meant family and community and schools, but it especially meant Christianity. And they were basically saying, look, we can't force Christians to do this job, but we sure hope they will, because the country won't work without it. And that's that failure that we're talking about. So yeah, this darkness that's come over the land, the MAGA movement, the strange nihilistic, just the way it seems to revel in tearing stuff down in lulls, the alt-right, but also on the left, you've got what looks to be a kind of woke religion, it's been called, and it is true that the structure of the post-critical everything movement does sort of mirror a kind of degenerate version of Protestantism, original sin, which is racism, and you have to repent, and especially if you're white and so forth. So yeah, it does look like, in lieu of actual Christianity, that people are substituting stuff, QAnon, which has these weird religious overtones, but also, the self-made religions and the crystals and the Wiccas. At best, these things are incompetent at doing the things the founders wanted, which is having long and deep moral traditions in inculcating Republican virtues in kids and providing us formats for transcendence. They're not very good at that. But at worst, the ones like MAGA and woke and QAnon, the ones you're talking about, they're actively toxic to the values of the founders. They're in that sense, they're toxic to the bloodstream of a liberal republic. And yeah, it's not just the cell phones, right? It is to do, I think, with the failure of the real thing and the kind of degenerate substitutes that come in.
I'm getting fascinated by the drug thing too. You got Elon Musk with the ketamine, and I wonder, the degree to which, or the paranoia that we're seeing, and the attraction to conspiracy theories is the result of an electorate that's perhaps token too many doobies these days. I don't know about that, but again, just to circle back, I mean, you've mentioned that this is a bipartisan phenomenon whereby folks on the right, sort of in the post-Christian world, are turning politics into a religion, sort of worshiping false idols. And you mentioned the left doing a similar thing with their, rituals and sinners being canceled. And, you can go through the whole, not original to me. And it just leads me to believe that there is something fundamental in us that needs. Was it Bob Dylan who said you got to worship something? I feel like that's true, and I don't, whether that is um, was there for some evolutionary reason, or whether it's because God put that in our hearts. Um, Once you take it away, people don't stop worshiping; they find something else to worship, and when that something else is politics, that's a scary, scary thing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. When I talk about the book, Matt, I get the most pushback, not from Christians, though the book is very critical of modern white evangelical movement for what I think are some poor, in fact, catastrophic choices. But I get the most pushback actually from the secular liberals who want to say, well, religion, faith really should not be necessary. I mean, aren't you saying, Rauch, that, you're throwing in the towel on the hope of a truly secular society that actually works? And the answer is, yeah, I kind of am, on empirical grounds. So in the last 20 years, we've seen an unprecedented de-churching in America. The numbers on this are just flabbergasting. Right through the 20th century, just to throw one at you, but there are many others, right through the 20th century, around 70% of Americans said that they went to a church, were members of a church. And that starts in the era of FDR and Truman, right through the end of the century. Today, in just the last 20 years, by 2020, it was below half. I mean, people, when I was born, you might be a bit too young, but when I was growing up, often the first question you asked of someone wasn't, where are you from, or what do you do for a living, or for God's sake, not where did you go to college? It was, what church do you belong to? Because everyone did. And now people just don't. So empirically, what's happened is during that same period, when Christianity has collapsed, is a rapid increase in all of those social indicators: isolation, loneliness, depression, anxiety, lack of meaning in life, and the substitution of these kinds of weird and nihilistic trends. And sure, some of that, I'm sure it's, I'm not a monocausal person. Some of it is cell phones and globalization, but it has to be that a chunk of that is losing those connections that we got to each other.
Yeah.
Community,
and
also gathering with others for the purpose of a higher thing, a higher being, and communing with that.
Yeah.
So seculars really, they resist that. They don't want to think that's the case. And for them, I retreat to the weaker version of my thesis, which is, okay, at least if Christianity is going to be here, and it will for a while, it would be a lot better if it were aligned with the values of liberal democracy and not against the values of liberal democracy. And the teachings of Jesus Christ are a lot closer to James Madison than to MAGA. So they are perfectly content with that narrower hypothesis.
I want to get to that in a second, but let me just throw a weird aside at you.
I know I can always count on you for a weird aside.
Because I'm like, do I go with the obvious segue to the next part of the book, or do I, divert with something random? This is a little more random. I learned a few years ago, this is before COVID. COVID maybe changed it a little bit, but before COVID, probably the number one thing you could do for your health was to join a choir. Like, joining a choir, like at a church, is better for your health than like quitting smoking and starting to run a mile a day. It was just had unbelievable health event. Now I know that there was, during the COVID era, there were people who got infected because of choirs. But in general, when we're not in a global pandemic, it's for reasons I don't fully understand. And there's an argument that it's actually the vibrations, but there's also an argument that it's just the communal nature and the transcendent. It could be a spiritual thing. I don't know. But for some weird thing, and I think I got this from, it was either from Arthur Brooks or from Daniel Pink. But anyway, a random aside, I put that out there. If you've got health issues, maybe join a choir, because for reasons nobody understands, it's good for you.
I am not a spiritual person. I'm not wired for transcendence. The closest I've come to that, though, was being a chorister in 2 performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It really doesn't get any better than that.
Did you find that did it give you happiness or health or any weird externalities?
Well, I don't know about externalities because, I'm generally a pretty stable and happy person, but I can tell you it gave me joy, which is an internality.
Better word. All right. So here's to the transition where I think you were heading, about how Jesus is very consistent with Madisonian democracy. And in the book, Cross Purposes, love the double entendre there. In the book, I think you're talking to a pastor or a theologian, and he points out that there are, kind of these 3 tenets of Christianity, and you find a way to argue that all 3 are like necessary ingredients in a healthy liberal democracy.
So you're ready for me to hit you with the big 3?
Hit me with the big 3. Let's do them one at a time, though, because we can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll do them one at a time. This isn't just me. This is actual Christians who say this, and I've talked to a bunch of them about it, and they all agree that these are 3 core teachings of Christianity, if you had to define it standing on one leg. Some say, well, repentance should also be on there, and some mention grace, but these 3 are big. Number 1, don't be afraid, which is the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible, they say. And this is asking you to keep your eyes fixed on the next world, not on this world, to believe that God has a plan for you. And so, although there are things to be afraid of in life, and also you should fear God, you should not let fear order your life. You should not be its servant. And when you meet things that are fearful in life, you should do that in a calm way with a certain amount of confidence. And when you encounter setbacks and hostility, you should meet that as a mission field, as something to bring the teachings of Christ to. So
I 100% agree.
Are you a Christian?
I am, and I sound like George H.W. 100% agree. Wouldn't be prudent. No, I completely agree with this. So first of all, anytime a human is visited upon by like an angel, the first thing they always say is, fear not. Don't be afraid, right? I also think fear is the opposite of faith. And so if you're about having faith, then fear would be the opposite of that.
All right. So let's make a little contrast here. The founders say something that pretty closely parallels "Do not be afraid," which is the main danger to our republic, a main danger, is the demagogue, the person who's going to wind you up by using fear, whether it's fear of a foreign enemy or fear of an internal enemy or fear of invasion by illegal immigrants, but it's always going to be fear. And they're going to say resist that. And they're also going to say sometimes you lose an election and you must not encounter that as an end of the world apocalyptic experience. You've got to understand sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and you can't approach that fearfully. You need to have some faith in our democratic republic that you win some and you lose some, but when you lose, you learn from the experience and you come back and you're better and the country's better. So in that way, it's counseling the same kind of far-viewed and calm kind of attitude that you see in Christianity. Now, of course, MAGA is the opposite of that. MAGA is all about fear. And the evangelical church, the white Protestant church, has become in many of its aspects what I call the church of fear. It's all about stoking Christians' fear that we're losing our country. It's no longer going to be safe to be a Christian. The country's being taken over by people not like us. They're going to trans all our children, on and on and on. It's all about fear.
None of it's in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible. If you read it sort of in its context, it's talking about helping the widow, helping the poor.
Well, that's the next of the big three.
Go ye into all the world. It doesn't say build a strong political base. In fact, the reason that a lot of Jewish folks at the time did not accept Jesus was because they wanted a military savior. This is me the evangelical, okay? I'm giving you my interpretation here. I hope it's not offensive to anybody. But they were looking for a military hero like a King David who would restore their honor and who would take on and vanquish their enemies. And instead, they got this Jesus guy who was talking about turning the other cheek. And not exactly what they had in mind, you know? And so I think that's part of the reason that they didn't recognize him as the quote unquote savior, because he did not present the way you would want a military or a political savior.
Well, it's also the reason that so many Christians reject his teachings today. They reject his teachings in the name of Christ. But this is the message of MAGA and Trump. It's be very afraid, and only I can protect you. He explicitly says this in 2016. He says it in 2024. He goes to Christians and he says, if you vote for me, if you support me, you'll have power. I will give you power. He even says power like you've never had before. And in exchange for that power, he says, you're going to give me your loyalty. Did you know this, Matt? You're a political junkie, so maybe you're that one person who knew this. That famous line where he says, my people are so loyal, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't leave their support for me. Do you know where he said that? Trivia question.
I do not.
That's Dordt College. That's an evangelical college in Iowa in January 2016. And that's the very same place where he says a few minutes earlier in the same speech, if you vote for me, you will have power. Remember that. Now, I'm not a Christian, but I know I've read the Christian Bible, and I seem to remember this part. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Jesus gets baptized, and then before he starts his ministry, he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and there he encounters Satan. And Satan takes him to the highest mountaintop and shows him all of earth's dominions and says, all of this can be yours if you bow down and worship me.
Yeah.
Does Jesus take that deal? No. Jesus says, "Go away, Satan." He resists that temptation, and he found that's the foundation of his ministry. It's not going to be about fear, domination, and politics. The modern white evangelical church made the opposite decision. It said, dangerous world, Trump protects us, we give him unconditional loyalty, in exchange we get power. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And they would say, we get power and freedom, religious liberty, freedom to continue to worship Jesus because the left is going to prevent us from doing that.
Yeah, they
So
would
that's
say
their
that.
motive. Jesus never said to do that. He never said, it's not really a part of the core mission. But I'm loving this. Okay. Let's go to number 2.
Number 2, be like Jesus. Imitate Jesus. This is what the evangelical tradition calls disciplement or discipleship or spiritual formation. Words I didn't actually know before I researched this book. You know, I'm a Jew, so no one tells me these things. But so, yeah, this is the idea that you form yourself on the model of Jesus, and you do that in your entire life, not just one particular small portion of your life. Okay, now think about what it is that Jesus models. One of the key things he models is egalitarianism and minority rights. He says we judge ourselves by how we treat the least of these. And he ministers to the most marginal, the poorest, the most oppressed. Another thing he is a believer in the inherent dignity and worth of every human individual who's in the image of God. That's the other reason he hangs out with the prostitutes and the downtrodden. He's saying, in the eyes of God, everyone has fundamental dignity. Those two fundamentals of Jesus's teaching translate over directly into the core ideas of the liberal tradition, starts with John Locke, enumerated more by Immanuel Kant, the greatest of the liberal ethicists, but John Rawls in the 20th century. So they're saying the same thing. They're saying in a liberal republic, there's some things majorities can't do because minorities have inherent rights as human beings. You judge a liberal republic not by the fact that it's a democracy based on the numbers, but on what the government cannot do, the limits on government power, especially as regards minorities, limits which are being traduced right now. And then the other thing that the classical liberal tradition tells us, it's what Kant said. It's the categorical imperative. But as Kant said, you always use people. You never use people as means to an end. Every human being is an end to themselves. The way Jefferson put this is all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. Inalienable rights. That's right out of Jesus. Not coincidentally, the founders were aware of Jesus. So here you have the core teachings of liberalism saying, well, so what should we not do? Well, how about not deny the humanity of our opponents? Like, for instance, taking a whole class of human beings and calling them vermin. Not something James Madison would do, and probably not something Jesus would do. Behave on social media with a constant stream of invective. Not something that Jesus would do, and so forth. So again, very close correspondence there.
I like it. Okay. Number 3.
Number 3, forgive each other. This one is really, really hard because humans are so flawed and we treat each other so badly. But this says, when someone mistreats you, you forgive them because judgment, can I use this word? Retribution belongs to God. It does not belong to man. So that translates into classic liberalism as sometimes you're going to win an election. And when you do, your idea is not to crush the other side, drive them out of politics, salt the ground with the tears of their women and children, and all those other things that, Steve Bannon and Elon Musk say they want to do. Your job is, because of the inherent dignity of everyone in our republic, but also because someday the tables may turn and you'll lose the election, you're going to treat the other side the way you want to be treated, with dignity and respect. You're going to continue to share the country with them. And that's a Republican virtue. You can't run a liberal democratic republic if people aren't willing to share the country when they win. So that's liberal forbearance. It's not quite the same as forgiveness. It doesn't have that same spiritual overlay, but it's a very similar concept. So I'm looking at this as a secular person, and I'm saying, wait a minute. So you're telling me that a lot of what's going wrong with our politics and a lot of what our Constitution needs to be supplied with in order to survive the next 5 to 10 years is right there in the teachings of Christianity, which conservative white Protestants have largely abandoned in favor of partisan politics, vituperation, fear. So you're telling me it's right there in the gospel? So that's the message.
Say, to me, anyone who grew up going to church and who was exposed to a Christian worldview would inherently be repelled by Trumpism and offended by it on every day. And for the reasons that you're describing here, and the fact that so many evangelicals, including many of my relatives, love Trump, I am still trying to figure out, although I think, power and the sense that they were attacked by the left explains a lot of it. There's a lot in this book we probably won't get to. You talk and write a lot about the LDS Church and how they're getting some things right. You talk about Christian nationalism, which we've only kind of touched on here. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. Everyone should get the book, Cross Purposes. I do want to ask, I know you mentioned Tim Keller in the book a lot, the late Tim Keller. And he is someone I had never got to meet, but he still has a podcast. They have a podcast of his sermons, and they have meant a lot to me. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and he is in the mix. Did you know Tim Keller?
Yes, I was deeply fortunate to get to know him in the 3 years or so before he died. And he was a major influence in this book, and he is the co-dedicatee of this book. I've been on a journey, Matt. I had a very different attitude toward Christianity when I was young. And as recently as 2003, at the front end of what turned into this massive wave of dechurching, I was writing about how great it is that America is becoming a secular country because religion is divisive and we'll have less of it, so we'll all be more enlightened and peaceful and happy. And boy, was I wrong about that. But also part of the journey that I've been on is getting to know Christians. I could name, people that the people that we've actually been to conferences together. Folks like Pete Wehner and Russell Moore. David French has become a friend. Curtis Chang, who's a former pastor, but also just regular Christians and pastors I've gotten to know, like, Pastor Groveton Baptist Church, and then Tim. And they have led me on a journey into understanding that what we're seeing in American political and public life is more like idolatry than Christianity. It is more like politics than preaching. It has very little in common with the Bible. And that it's Christians themselves who are seeing this and understanding it, and who have come to realize that there is a deep crisis in the church of having exchanged the words of Jesus for the language of politics. And yeah, Tim was a huge part of that. He was not political. He deplored what was happening in the church, though. But the main thing he did is, I'm a reasonably bright person. I got high SATs and got into Yale. So, bully for me. Tim had a giant intellect. He had an encompassing mind. You hear that in his sermons. He's able to travel the whole world intellectually and put it together. And when you're in the presence of a mind like that, and he's Christian and you're not, the one thing you can't say is, well, he's the dumb guy in this conversation because he believes in all that Christian spiritual mumbo jumbo. You just can't do that. So you have to understand there's something there that's powerful and important. And that's part of what led me to dive in and conclude that what's powerful and important is Jesus. And you don't have to be a believer in Christianity to think that Jesus got some very important things right.
Awesome. Well, let's leave it at that. But I do want to highly recommend this book. It's not that thick, but it is packed full of thought-provoking ideas and insight. And as I mentioned, there's several things we didn't even get to. So check it out. It's called Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. Jonathan Rauch, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thank you.